Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's May 23rd, 2025. I'm Jeff. Joining me is my co-host Ness. We're going to start off by discussing Christian Zionism. Is it compatible with historical Christianity, or is it a sharp divergence? So first, let's start with the definition of Christian Zionism. Here's one I've come up with. Christian Zionism is a belief system within certain Protestant traditions, especially evangelicalism, that supports the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel as a fulfillment of biblical prophecy and a precursor to the second coming of Christ. It holds that modern Israel plays a divine role in God's eschatological plan. Key features include a literal interpretation of biblical prophecy, political and theological support for the modern state of Israel, and a belief that the Jewish people remain central in God's redemptive history. Last week, we talked about, in the context of Kanye West's new single, Heil Hitler, we delved into a lot of aspects of that. One of the aspects we looked at was how Kanye West's Christianity played a role in his views towards the Jews and Hitler. And in that context, we went through some of the thinkers and Christian thinkers and what they thought towards Jews. We talked about Origen. We talked about Augustine, Aquinas, Martin Luther. And we're not going to go into detail. We're not going to rehash that. But the TLDR summary version is that these thinkers had pretty negative views of Jews. I think it's fair to summarize their beliefs that Jews were very misguided and wrong, and that the only hope they had was to see the light and acknowledge Jesus Christ as the Messiah. Their intransigence on this issue justified a lot of the harsh treatment that they received in the eyes of these thinkers. All of these thinkers could be described as subscribing to supersessionism. It's the belief that the church had replaced Israel as God's chosen people. So at one time, of course, the Jews, the Hebrews, were God's chosen people. But once Jesus came, that changed, and everybody was eligible for the grace of God. It was no longer just limited to the Jews. And this was the dominant, exclusive belief in Christianity for 1900 years or so after Christ, and only in the last 150 years has there emerged this doctrine that we call dispensationalism. And this essentially affirms an ongoing covenant between God and the Jewish people apart from belief in Christ. And traditional Christian theology had no concept of a return to a physical Jewish nation state, and especially not as a positive development. The modern state of Israel, which was established in 1948, is often seen by Christian Zionists as a prophetic fulfillment, but this connection is entirely absent from historic Christian thought. Augustine's theology, for instance, emphasized the spiritual Israel, i.e. the church, not the earthly one. But everything changed, really, with the Holocaust and the rise of modern Israel. This triggered a rethinking of Christian theology regarding the Jews, especially in Protestant America. Christian Zionism emerged alongside this reevaluation. But we want to emphasize this is a reactionary and modern thought, not a continuation of traditional beliefs. This is a radical break.
Yeah, I think reactionary is a perfectly fine term there. It often is conflated with a term like conventional or traditional, but it need not to be that. Although, to be fair, in some ways, I think dispensationalists have a strong emphasis on the Old Testament and take literally the prophecies made in the Old Testament and then fast forward 2,000 years and have them, 2,500 years and have them taking place today in the modern state of Israel. But the problem with that from a traditional Christian perspective is it effectively skips over the Gospels and throws out virtually all of the teachings of Jesus in the Gospels, where it is made clear again and again, overtly, readers are beaten over the head with Jesus' emphasis on the spiritual belief and his de-emphasis on anything that is physical, that is tied to a physical place, that is governed by specific laws for particular physical buildings and specific people. The dispensationalists, modern Christian Zionists, will put emphasis on the construction of the third temple to replace the second temple that was destroyed by the Romans during the reign of Vespasian and Titus. And that, again, skips over the most important underlying message of what the manifestation of the church on earth is from Christ and from God's perspective. Matthew 18:20, Jesus says, "For where 2 or 3 gather in my name, there I am among them." And so the emphasis on a physical location, and so in light of that, the emphasis on a physical location seems entirely incongruent. And skipping over, again, to belabor the point, skipping over the Gospels is a tricky thing to do and still maintain a fidelity to historical Christian thought. And so it's not surprising with this understanding that as Jeff had mentioned, that this sort of thinking was totally absent from Christian thought for 1900 years.
And so that thought that was present for 1900 years is boiled down. Jewish salvation or election was seen as conditional on accepting Christ. That was the only way that anyone, even Jews, could attain salvation, was to accept Jesus Christ. But Christian Zionism regards Jews as still chosen, even in unbelief. This is a sharp theological divergence from Christianity.
Which is interesting because the Old Testament is filled with stories of, at God's command, the Hebrews putting to the sword entire populations that would not accept God's revelation. And so it is a little bit disjointed to think that that same God would, after 2,000 years of the most important fundamental prophecy being fulfilled through Jesus Christ, that the people who rejected that 2,000 years later would be blessed in the way that Christian Zionists believe that the modern state of Israel is. Take Saul, for example, who had his line wiped out and was to be punished, his descendants to be punished through the ages because he failed to completely put to the sword all of the people that God demanded that he put to the sword for their unbelief. That's where we get the line of David, which ultimately is the line that Jesus is descended from.
Speaking of the more violent aspects of the Christian God and the Jewish God, Ness mentioned last time that for the establishment of modern-day Israel in the Levant, in the Middle East, it is motivated by a similar impulse that motivated the medieval Crusades, a sort of enthusiastic, martial, violent outlet for zeal, for religious belief, and that the Christians are getting that same sort of thrill that they are not allowed to get anymore. The only way would be to establish some sort of modern-day crusader kingdom in the Levant. So the best that they have, the alternative they have, is Israel. And I think this is plausible on the surface, but it's actually pretty superficial and misleading. And Ness knows more about the Crusades than me, but put simply, the Crusaders were not supporting Jewish return or fulfillment of prophecy. Their goal was to conquer Jerusalem for Christendom, not restore it to the Jews. The ideology was replacement and triumphalist, rooted in the belief that Christianity had superseded Judaism and Islam alike. Jews were often massacred en route to the Holy Land as Christ killers, not honored as God's chosen. So in short, the Crusades reflect Christian dominance over the Holy Land, not Christian partnership with Jews or a theological validation of modern Israel. Thus, they stand in stark contrast to Christian Zionism's philo-Semitic and prophetic framework. So, long story short, Christian Zionism is not compatible with most of Christianity's 2,000-year theological tradition. It represents a dramatic shift. It rejects supersessionism and embraces Jewish statehood as divine destiny and completely reframes the role of Jews in eschatology or end times. So put another way, if historical Christianity viewed Jews as a witness people under divine judgment, Christian Zionism sees Jews as active agents in God's unfolding plan.
Yes, I take no issue with that characterization. The several crusades were derailed by crusading armies taking digressions from the main route to go settle scores with various Jewish townships and places of worship. Jewish side quests where the Crusaders would enter a township and the Jews would be causing trouble, and they would have the option to take some plunder to help God, of course, and to help Jesus, and also to help themselves on the way to the Holy Land, which was the main adventure. But the differences between the ostensible motivations of the Crusades and those of Christian Zionists with regards to the modern state of Israel can be bridged by taking Christianity's historical animosity towards Christianity and turning it into a sort of melded religion. We see the same time or shortly after the birth of Christian Zionism, we get the term Judeo-Christian, which was another term that was not at all in existence for 1900 years of Christian history following the crucifixion of Christ. And the idea that the Jewish God and the Christian God are the same would be a little bit, even the idea of Jews as somehow being faithful descendants of Abraham rather than effectively disbelievers, apostates, which is how Christian thinkers thought about the Jews for 1900 years. By revising all that away to gloss over 1900 years of conflict between Christianity and Judaism, we are able to get Christian Zionism, where the goals of Christianity are ported onto the goals of secular Judaism. Whatever the political and cultural merits of that, there is clearly, from my perspective anyway, no scriptural justification at all, which, again, to emphasize, that is why for 1900 years no one bothered to make that argument, because there is no argument to be made.
Moving on to another related topic, something I've been thinking about. Why did Christianity catch on in Europe in the first place? It is a cult from the Levant, as we said. It's a Semitic. It has nothing to do with Europe, and yet it became almost synonymous with white people. So what about Christianity, of all the competing religions or cults, what about Christianity was so appealing to white people?
One answer might be that it was true, and that the idea that it was a cult that is a little bit of a loaded term, although I take Jeff's perspective on it. And I think, too, to be a little nitpicky, I don't know if it's quite accurate to say that it was totally foreign to Europe. The Gospels took place under Roman-dominated lands with a very strong Greek influence that all of the players, particularly in the New Testament, were very familiar with Greek philosophical traditions and Roman law. And so it was on the outskirts of European civilization, but it wasn't foreign in the same way that something from sub-Saharan Africa or from the Orient would be.
First appealing aspect to white people about Christianity, openness to universalism and abstraction. So Christianity claims to be a truth for all mankind, not just one tribe or one city-state. And so this resonated with late Roman thinkers who had already begun to move beyond ethnic religion toward philosophical universalism, such as Stoicism. Europeans showed a willingness to abandon localized tribal gods in favor of a morally and metaphysically expansive framework. And that openness is a recurring European trait. The same impulse later gave birth to the Enlightenment, scientific rationalism, and global humanitarianism. But this is something I want to get at in a minute. It left Europe vulnerable to displacing its own ancestral frameworks in pursuit of a higher or more universal, quote, truth. And post-Roman Europe was fragmented, chaotic, plagued by violence, and Christianity offered not just personal salvation, but a binding moral order, a code of behavior, a vision of time and history, and institutions such as the church that imposed structure. On the other hand, paganism was local, mythic, often cyclical, and tied to a tribal past. And so what we're getting at here is maybe Europeans prioritize cohesion. And so something like Christianity that was seen as a great tool of cohesion was appealing to them.
Yes, I think the desire for that cohesion and the movement of Europe towards it predates the onset of the influence of Christianity in the Roman Empire during the crisis of the 3rd century. 35 years before Emperor Constantine would come on the scene and effectively convert the Roman Empire to Christianity, the Emperor Aurelian was working to unite the military and the Roman world around the figure of Sol Invictus as a universalizing, ultimate, almost monotheistic, that's not quite accurate, but quasi-monotheistic deity. And so the groundwork for that unifying force was already evident prior to the adoption of Christianity in elite structures in the Roman world.
There's another way to look at this. I would describe it probably best articulated by Nietzsche, that sees Christianity as a loss or a rejection of indigenous European culture and civilization. That Christianity's triumph represents a rupture in European civilizational continuity. The ancient myths, rituals, and seasonal rhythms that once defined pre-Christian Europe were not gradually transformed, but actively stamped out, often violently. Temples were destroyed, priesthoods eradicated, oral traditions lost. The cultural memory of European paganism was broken, then later romanticized or rediscovered through art, folklore, or nationalist revival.
For that paganism to find a European audience, a modern European audience, it had to be romanticized, because if it were not, it would be more akin to what Cortez experienced in North America when he came across the Aztecs and the indigenous religions of the North American continent. There is little that is redemptive or that is civilizationally sustaining in those paganist practices that don't differ that widely from that of Northern Europe to North America.
Another angle you could take on this is Christianity's success in Europe demonstrates Europe's ability, its tendency, its ability to assimilate foreign ideas and elevate them into something distinct. So Christianity may have originated in the Levant, but it became something uniquely European by the time of Augustine, Aquinas, and the Gothic cathedrals. Just as the Romans took Greek philosophy and made it law and empire, Europeans took Christianity and made it theology, architecture, and civilization. And so in this view, adoption doesn't equal surrender. Instead, the ability to synthesize foreign and native elements may be a core feature of European identity, not weakness, but adaptability.
You mentioned Nietzsche previously, and one of Nietzsche's recurring criticisms of Christianity was that it gelded the European spirit, the European man, and pacified him.
Yeah, I think you're referring to what the slave morality.
Yeah. Don't tempt me. We go into an entire episode on master versus slave morality and how that manifests today. Even though I'll be critical of him here, I am the first to admit that there is a lot of good that comes out of Nietzsche's writings. But in lamenting the fall of pagan Europe and it being displaced abruptly by Christianity, a putatively pacifistic Christianity, I think there's a problem there because these warrior pagan cultures were, by and large, forcibly converted at the point of a sword by professed Christianity. God laughs at your four winds. Or to read from Psalm 46, verses 6 and 7, nations rage, kingdoms topple, the earth melts when he lifts his voice. The Lord of armies is with us, the God of Jacob is our stronghold.
So I don't have clear opinions on this topic of why Christianity caught on in Europe, what about it made it so appealing to white people. But the fact that it is a Semitic, somewhat foreign, although Ness made a good point that it's maybe not quite as a foreign source as I made it out to be, but at the very least, it's certainly was on the fringes of European civilization. It wasn't something core to Europe, and yet it got a foothold in Europe and completely transformed it. And in my opinion, the verdict is still out on whether that was a good or a bad thing.
I'm agnostic about the truth claims of Christianity, but there is an answer there as to why it was so successful, and that is because it is effectively true. The idea that it was God's intention and God's guidance that led to it being adopted. That's certainly what Constantine is recorded as having thought, and his momentous decision to effectively make the most powerful secular institution in European history, at least up to that point, if not ever in European history, to meld that with Christianity could be coincidental, or it could be, as Jeff had talked about, on account of Christians being universalistic in spirit and builders of moral and institutional order. There is, of course, if we look at the timeline, we're 300 years in the future before this becomes relevant, but there is a question as to why Islam was not adopted in the same way in Europe as it was in much of the rest of the world that gave birth to Christianity, because Islam is also universalistic, but does not seem to be in the same way susceptible to displacing its own traditions, nor is it uniquely gifted at transforming outside influences into new civilizational expressions, or at least that seemed to be the case. That the question is still an open one there, because we could be in real time witnessing a transformation of Europe into a continent that is predominantly Islamic in its religious expression. Anyway, a lot of interesting questions here, even if we don't have definitive answers. I want to switch gears here to what will likely become a recurring theme. It already has to some extent, but we'll give it a name here, and that is the dollar death segment. Moody's this week downgraded U.S. Treasury debt from AAA to AA plus or something. It's the third and final major credit rating agency to downgrade U.S. dollar debt. These agencies missed massively on the 2008 crisis. They are always looking in the rearview mirror, and so I would not look to any of those rating agencies as organizations that are going to preemptively notice something that other people don't see, but I think it is of symbolic importance. This paired with ever-growing goods trade deficits month after month after month, with America importing hundreds of billions, triple-figure billion-dollar amounts of physical things into the country each month beyond what America exports physically, an increasing reticence of foreign nations to buy U.S. Treasury debt, the economic disruptions from tariffs, or at least that are being blamed on tariffs. And I think, too, the AI revolution threatening to hit the service segment of the world economies harder than the manufacturing and production, physical productive side of the world economy. And of course, the United States, while it runs a massive deficit in physical goods, it does maintain a more modest surplus in services. But I think the AI revolution threatens services more than it does physical goods. And so I think these confluence of factors is bringing us ever closer to the death of the dollar as the world's reserve currency. And when that happens, those massive trade deficits are no longer possible.
So I'll be upfront about my ignorance of economics, but I do have a question for you, Ness. When you say the U.S. dollar will no longer be the world's reserve currency, what does that mean, and how will it affect average Americans' daily lives? What is it going to be? Something that happens overnight? Is it going to be a gradual thing? What are the immediate, tangible effects of the dollar no longer being the world's reserve currency?
It means countries that trade with one another, when neither the producer nor the receiver are American, when, say, China trades with Russia, or Russia trades with the Congo, or India trades with Australia, increasingly those transactions will not be denominated in dollars. And the same thing will take place in foreign exchange markets, where when converting ruble into yuan, the intermediary currency is US dollars to facilitate that exchange. And as those things continue to decline, and looking here now, in 2000, 71% of all foreign exchange reserves were US dollars. So that is a country that represents 4% of the world's population, accounting for 71% of the world's exchanged reserves. And now in 2024, it has dropped to 58%, but much of that drop has occurred in the last 5 years. And you needing to utilize US dollars to facilitate exchanges in trade and currency between two countries, neither of which are the United States, creates a global demand for US dollars, which increases the purchasing power of those US dollars. And American consumers benefit from that because their dollar, because Russia and China, and I'm using these two facetiously because they are so salient as being two of the countries that have moved strongly away from the US dollar, but there will be other countries that will continue to follow their lead. But as these foreign countries move away from using the dollar, the purchasing power benefit that Americans get from the rest of the world trying to get these dollars to exchange between one another and putting a premium on the amount of money they'll pay for those dollars means that Americans buying things from anywhere else in the world enjoy a premium because people all over the world will give more stuff for those dollars because those dollars have value beyond what physical goods they're able to command. But as that continues to diminish and potentially disappears entirely, the result will be on the ground floor for American citizens will be a continual increase in consumer prices for consumables. And what that would mean in practical effect would be that the increase in prices that have characterized so much of the anxiety and political energy since 2020. If you look at polling about what Americans are most concerned about, it is overwhelmingly about the economy in general, and particularly in regards to price increases. And so if the increase in the Walmart bill from 2020 to 2025 was 70%, well, if the dollar collapses as the world's reserve currency, then from 2025 to 2030, it might be something more like 150% or 200%. So I think we have a taste already, a little bit of a taste of what material life would look like in America post-dollar dominance. More blackpilling news on the domestic front from a YouGov Economist poll this week that asked about both how Americans feel about illegal aliens resident in the United States, if they should be able to be granted citizenship or be permitted to stay in the country. 38% said that they should be able to stay in the U.S. and apply for citizenship, and an additional 8% said that they should be able to stay as legal residents in the United States, but not to be granted full citizenship. So you add those two numbers together, and we get a figure of 41% of Americans saying that illegals present in the country should be permitted to legally stay here. The survey also asked Americans if they supported granting refugee status to the 50 white South African farmers that the Trump administration welcomed as refugees. The percentages of Americans who support this is 33%. So we have a situation, this is the exact same polling population. We have a situation where 41% of Americans are fine with illegal aliens being here, but just 33% are fine with genuine, legitimate South African white refugees coming in, even though the cultural and linguistic and economic and religious affinities between heritage Americans and white South Africans is much closer than it is for illegal aliens. I say even though, but I think that is more of a feature rather than a bug. But even though this granting of asylum status has not apparently been especially politically popular, Trump has doubled down on it, hosting the president of South Africa and subjecting him to humiliation about the political chance that the EEF leader, who is an ally of Ramaphosa, or whatever the current president of South Africa's name is, the ANC, he's the ANC party leader, but EEF is a smaller, more radically Marxist, racialist party that has about 10% of South African support. They are allies, and Julius Malema, the leader of the EEF, has been shown on video singing songs to stadium-sized crowds about killing white Afrikaners, and Trump subjected the world to this while the South African delegation was sitting there with him. Even though the South African delegation refused to look at the television, it was clear that they were being humiliated. And what struck me immediately, to focus on a point that we made last week, what struck me immediately was the fact that had Trump done this 7 or 8 years ago, the ADL and AIPAC, the SPLC, would have been jumping down his throat about how horribly bigoted it was to bring up concerns about white oppression, or whites being oppressed in South Africa, about even white genocide, which is a phrase you're hearing prominent people in America talking about now. He would have been filleted for doing this. And now, 8 years later, there isn't a peep from the ADL or from AIPAC or from any of the other pro-Jewish groups that have apparently, I think, really turned on South Africa and the narrative that apartheid was some sort of horrible evil, and that what has come after apartheid in South Africa is a vision for the future of humanity. That is something they would have eagerly granted assent to a decade ago, but that is no longer the case. And as an unapologetic heritage American myself, I am glad to see it. Although the suffering that is taking place in the Middle East is regrettable, there isn't anything I can do about it anyway. And if one of the benefits is that white advocacy and white identitarianism to go alongside all of the other identitarianisms that are permitted in the modern Western world, if that becomes accepted in America, it's going to be because the cultural shaping, cultural policing, overly Israeli and Jewish focused groups like AIPAC and the ADL approve of it, or at least no longer viciously condemn it.
Kudos to the Trump administration for facilitating the Afrikaners' refugee status. And like so often is the case, Trump is directionally correct but factually incorrect. He got many of the facts wrong when he was speaking with Ramaphosa in the Oval Office, or in the White House. And of course, the predictable, as always, media response is to freak out over Trump getting the facts incorrect. But in the process of that, they are forced to adopt Trump's frame, act within the frame that Trump has set regarding the broadest sense, the dysfunction of South Africa. And so now everybody has to dig into or discuss South Africa. And while the numbers are grossly exaggerated, the fact is there are farmers being murdered in South Africa. And so just the fact of talking about it, again, chips away at this idea that South Africa is this multicultural utopia.
If one of the upshots of this are people doing image searches for South African farm murders, then it's potentially going to have an effect that is similar to the effect that the Israeli action against the Gaza Strip over the last year and a half has had, in terms of how people react to the videos and pictures of women and children being blown apart by 2,000-pound bunker-busting bombs. In the case of the South African murders, it is even more grisly than that, because the combat, such as it is, tends to be hand-to-hand and more of a Rwandan genocide style of butchery. And speaking of the grisly topic of death, I want to close off by turning our attention to Scott Adams, the Dilbert cartoon creator, who announced this week that he has terminal cancer. In Adams' own words, quote, "I have the same cancer that Joe Biden has. I also have prostate cancer that has spread to my bones. My life expectancy is maybe this summer. I expect to be checking out from this domain sometime this summer. I can tell you that I don't have good days. So if you're wondering, hey, Scott, do you have any good days? Nope. Every day is a nightmare, and evening is even worse. I do have the ability to kind of get up for this part of the day, but I'm in pain. I'm always in pain, and the pain moves around to different parts of my body. I've been using a walker to walk for months now," unquote. In communicating this, though, there is a real dignity in the way that he presents this information, in a way that quotes might not give full justice. So we'll listen to a few words directly from him.
Now, I realize that for some of you, this is hitting you kind of hard because you're hearing it for the first time. Weirdly, since it's old news to me, I've just sort of processed it. So it just sort of is what it is. And I have to say that, everybody has to die, as far as I know. And it's kind of civilized that you know about how long you have, so you can put your affairs together and make sure you've said your goodbyes and done all the things you need to do. So if you had to pick a way to die, this one's really painful, like really, really painful. But it's also kind of good that it gives you enough time while your brain is still working to wrap things up. You might wonder why it took me so long to tell you, and I think I owe you an answer to that. Number one, it would change my life because everybody would start treating me like the cancer guy. You can't really there's no second way that goes. Once you go public, you're just the dying cancer guy. And I didn't want you to have to think about it. And I didn't want to have to think about it. You should know, well, if you didn't already know, I am unusually mentally tough. So while this could be much worse, for some people, I suppose, I'm handling it quite well. The pain is tough. I mean, really tough. But the mental part, I got that under control. And I can see in the comments that some of you are having a tough time with it. But remember, nothing lasts forever. Nothing lasts forever.
Comparing that calm, thoughtful reflection on his own impending death and contrasting it to hysteria that we've all been subjected to over the last several years about microaggressions and perceived racist slights and all of these other things that get totally blown out of proportion. People being misgendered at a restaurant or something and flipping their lid and absolutely losing their stuff. Adam's dignity is such a refreshing, stark contrast to that. Stoicism's ultimate test of a person is how he handles death, and it appears that Adams is acing it. He doesn't come across as bitter or resentful, even though it's plausible, as he was a very staunch COVIDian, that having taken the shot that he advocated others take is what ultimately killed him. That's conjecture. I won't be able to prove that definitively, but there is a lot of anecdotal evidence and increasingly some formal evidence as well that specifically with cancers that go into remission, that the effects of the COVID shots are to jumpstart those cancers starting back up again. But whatever that exact relationship is, nonetheless, the way that he is handling it is commendable. It is entirely laudable, and it is worth reflecting on the fact that you and me and everyone listening to this, everyone alive right now, is closer to dying than he ever has been at any point in his life up to that point. Death smiles at us all. All a man can do is smile back. And that'll do it for us this week. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.